worked with my hands for 31 years. That's the first thing people need to understand about me, because everything else, every decision I made, every dollar I spent, every sacrifice that came back to haunt me, starts there. I was an HVAC technician out of Columbus, Ohio. Started as an apprentice at 19, sweating through summers in attics and crawling through basements in January. By the time I was 30, I had my own small company. Nothing fancy. 6 trucks, 8 guys, a reputation for showing up on time and not overcharging widows. My ex-wife used to say I was better at fixing other people's problems than my own. She wasn't wrong. My son's name is Philip. He was 17 when his mother and I divorced, and I'll carry that guilt to my grave. Not because the marriage failed, some things aren't meant to last, but because of what came after. The way he looked at me across the kitchen table when I told him I was moving out. 14 years later, I can still see it. A kid trying to decide whether to be angry or sad and settling on something worse, silence. I spent the next few years trying to buy back what I'd broken. I don't say that with pride. I paid for his college, first at Ohio State where he studied pre-med, then at Case Western for medical school. I told myself I was being a good father. Looking back, I was being a guilty one. There's a difference, and it cost me more than money. Philip graduated medical school in the spring of 2019. I drove up to Cleveland for the ceremony, sat in the bleachers in a new shirt I'd bought specifically for that day. Navy blue. Still had the fold lines from the packaging. When they called his name and he walked across the stage, I stood up without thinking. Just stood there clapping in the middle of a row of strangers. A woman next to me put her hand on my arm and said, "Your son?" And I said, "Yeah." And I meant it the way you mean something when it cost you everything you had. His girlfriend at the time was a woman named Courtney. They'd been together since his 3rd year of medical school. She was from a family in Westlake, a suburb outside Cleveland. The kind of neighborhood where the homes have names instead of addresses and the Christmas lights go up before Thanksgiving. Her father was a corporate attorney. Her mother volunteered on 3 different nonprofit boards. They were polite to me the few times we'd met. Careful, I'd say now. The kind of polite that keeps a distance without ever being rude enough to call out. Philip and Courtney got married in the fall of 2020. Small ceremony because of everything that was happening in the world that year. I gave a toast. I said that watching Philip become a doctor had been the proudest moment of my life, and that I hoped he and Courtney would build something that lasted. I meant every word. What I didn't know then was that Courtney had already decided what kind of father-in-law I was going to be. I found that out slowly, the way you find a leak. Not in one dramatic moment, but in small things over time. The way she answered my calls when Philip was in the room versus when he wasn't. The way she described her family's gatherings as our people getting together in a way that never quite included me. The way she explained once when I asked about coming for Christmas that they were doing just immediate family this year. I let it go. I told myself this was how young couples were. They needed space. I didn't want to be one of those fathers who couldn't let go. In 2022, Philip told me he was ready to open his own practice. Sports medicine. He'd done his residency, built up contacts, and had a vision for a clinic that would serve both high school and college athletes in the greater Cleveland area. He was excited in a way I hadn't seen since he was a kid talking about the Cleveland Browns. It was good to see. He needed startup capital, the commercial space, equipment, malpractice insurance, staffing for the first 6 months. He'd done the math. He needed around $220,000. I didn't have that sitting in a savings account. What I did have was a property in Gahanna I'd bought in 2014, a small commercial unit I'd been renting out to a flooring company. It was worth close to $300,000 by then. I'd been holding on to it as retirement security. I sold it. I didn't tell him what it cost me. I just told him I believed in him, and I wired the money in 2 transfers. He called me when the first one cleared and he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Dad, I don't know what to say." I said, "Don't say anything. Just build something good." Over the next 18 months, I watched him do exactly that. The clinic opened in early 2023. I drove up to see it before patients started coming in. Just me and Philip walking through the empty rooms, him pointing out where the treatment tables would go, where he planned to hang his diplomas. I took a photo of him standing in the doorway. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere. Courtney was there that day, friendly enough. She walked me through the reception area and told me about the branding she'd done for the practice. She'd helped design the logo, the website, the social media presence. It was impressive work. I told her so. She smiled and said we wanted to reflect a certain image. I noticed she didn't say thank you, not to me specifically, not once that day. The clinic grew faster than either of them expected. By the end of the first year, Philip had 2 additional staff members and a waiting list. Courtney had started referring to it in conversation as our practice, which I understood. She'd contributed real work to the marketing side. But there were moments. Small ones. A holiday card that year signed Dr. Philip and Courtney with a photo I'd never seen. No mention of family. A birthday call from Philip in which Courtney was audible in the background saying something about dinner reservations, and the call ended after 4 minutes. I told myself these things didn't add up to anything. I was reading into it because I was lonely. I had sold my retirement property and driven 4 hours round trip a dozen times that year, and I was waiting for something I couldn't name. Acknowledgement, maybe. I don't know. I told myself to stop counting. Then, in March of this year, Philip called to tell me the practice was hitting its 2-year milestone and they were planning a celebration. A dinner event, he said. A real thing. Rented venue. Catered. Colleagues and mentors and people who'd been part of the journey. I asked him when it was. He said the 15th. I told him I'd clear my schedule. I asked if he wanted me to drive up the night before or the morning of. He said he'd get back to me on the details. He didn't get back to me. I waited a week. I called on a Saturday morning and got voicemail. I texted. He replied that evening, "Sorry, Dad, been slammed. I'll call you this week." He didn't call. On the 16th, I tried again. Courtney picked up. Philip's phone. Courtney's voice. She sounded surprised to hear me, or maybe she sounded like someone who had been waiting to hear something and was now calculating how to respond to it. She said, "Oh, good morning. Yeah, the event was last night. It was beautiful. Really a special evening." I said, "Last night?" She said, "Yes. We had about 40 people. The venue was gorgeous." I asked why I hadn't heard anything. There was a pause. Then she said, "We kept it to professional connections and immediate family. People from the medical community, his mentors from residency, my parents." Another pause. "We didn't think it would really be your crowd, honestly. It was a pretty formal affair." I stood in my kitchen holding my phone. Outside my window, my neighbor was mowing his lawn. I watched him for a moment while I decided what to say. I said, "I see." She said, "I hope you understand. These things are about image, you know? The people who come set a tone." I said, "Thank you for explaining that." I said goodbye. I set the phone down on the counter. I stood there for a long time. Let me be clear about what she said. Because I want to be precise, she did not say I hadn't been invited. She explained that I hadn't been invited because a dinner celebrating a medical practice that existed because I sold my retirement property was, in her assessment, not my crowd. Because I am an HVAC technician, because I don't have a medical degree or a law degree or a seat on a nonprofit board, because of what I am, which is a man who worked with his hands so his son wouldn't have to. I did not call Philip that day. I needed to think. I spent a week doing what I probably should have done 2 years earlier. I went through what I had in writing, the records from the property sale, the wire transfer confirmations. I wasn't operating under any illusions about getting money back. What I was doing was getting clear. There's a difference between being upset and being clear, and I needed to be clear before I did anything. I also started paying attention to things I'd been ignoring. I'm on Philip and Courtney's social media. They'd never thought to block his father, I suppose, and I went back through the last 2 years. The vacation photos from Scottsdale, the kitchen renovation they'd done over the summer, the posts about Courtney's car, a loaded SUV she'd gotten in the fall. I don't begrudge people's success, but I know what a brand new medical practice cash flow looks like in year 1. I helped build one. What I was looking at wasn't sustainable on what a 2-year clinic and a marketing director's salary could support. someone was making up the difference, and I was the only person in their lives who would put in $220,000 without a contract or a repayment schedule. I want to be honest here. Part of me had known this was going where it was going. But knowing something and facing it are different things. And I had spent years choosing not to face it because Philip was my son, and I loved him, and I had already failed him once when he was 17 and I left. I wasn't going to fail him again, except I needed to understand what failing him actually meant. And I'd gotten that confused. On the 1st of April, and yes, I am aware of the date, and yes, it has not been lost on me. I called my bank. I have banked at the same regional institution in Columbus for 26 years. My contact there is a woman named Helen who has known me since I was running 4 trucks and trying to qualify for a business line of credit. I told her I needed to review everything connected to Philip's account linkages and my standing transfer authorizations. I had set up an arrangement 2 years ago where I had access to move funds to his business account quickly if he needed emergency capital in the early months. That arrangement was still in place. I had Helen close it. Then I called my financial advisor and I told him what I was thinking about my will and my remaining assets. I said I needed some things restructured. He didn't ask many questions. He'd met Courtney once at a lunch I'd set up when the clinic first opened. He just said, "I'll draw up the paperwork." I didn't call Philip. I waited. He called me on a Thursday, 3 weeks later. It was late morning. He opened with small talk, which told me something was wrong because Philip isn't a small talk starter with me. We don't have that kind of padding in our conversations. We get to the point. After 2 minutes, he said, "Hey, I wanted to ask, have you had a chance to talk to the bank recently? Courtney was trying to pull something together for a piece of equipment we've been looking at, and she mentioned there might be a change in the account access." I said yes, I'd made some changes. He said, "Oh, okay. Was there a reason?" I said, "There were a few reasons. I've been doing some thinking about how I've been managing my finances." There was a silence. Then he said, "Dad, is something wrong?" I said, "I don't know, Philip. Is something wrong?" He didn't answer that. He said, "Courtney mentioned she talked to you a few weeks ago." I said, "She did." He said, "About the dinner." I said, "Yes." Another silence. Longer this time. I let it sit. I've learned in my 60s that silence is a tool, and most people are too uncomfortable to use it. Finally, he said, "I should have called you. I know that." I said, "You should have." He said, "She thought it would be easier to just, it's complicated, Dad." I said, "Help me understand the complicated part. Because from where I'm standing, it's pretty straightforward. I gave you everything I had to help you build that practice. I drove up and walked through those rooms with you. And when you celebrated what we built, I found out after the fact from your wife who told me I wasn't the right kind of person to be in the room." He didn't say anything for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter. He said, "That's not how I see you." I said, "Then you need to think about what you let happen, because that's how she treated me, and you let her, and then you didn't call." I heard him exhale. I said, "I'm not angry, Philip. I want you to understand that. I'm not calling you to fight, but I closed the account access because I realized I'd been so focused on giving you everything you needed that I stopped asking whether the relationship was going both ways. And I need it to go both ways. I'm your father, not your bank." He said, "I know." I said, "I don't think you do yet, but I think you will." We talked for another hour. It was not comfortable. There were things said on both sides that had been waiting years to be said. He told me that Courtney had strong opinions about family image and that he'd been trying to manage 2 sets of expectations and had made bad calls. I told him that managing 2 sets of expectations was part of marriage, but that choosing one set by simply not telling the other person wasn't managing anything. It was avoiding. He asked if I was cutting him off. I said no. I said I was his father and nothing would change that. But I said I needed him to understand that I was a person, not a resource. That what I'd given him had cost me my retirement safety net. And that going forward, if this relationship was going to work, it needed to be a relationship, not a transaction with the occasional phone call. He was quiet again. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I said, I need you to be honest with yourself about what's happened. I need you to talk to your wife. And I need you to call me because you want to talk to your father, not because Courtney noticed an account change. He said he understood. We left it there. That was 6 weeks ago. In those 6 weeks, Philip has called me 4 times. Twice, just to check in, no agenda, no ask. Once to tell me about a patient case he found interesting and thought I'd appreciate. Once on a Sunday morning when he said he'd been thinking about things and he wanted to say he was sorry. Not for one specific moment, but for the pattern, for the years of letting things slide because it was easier. That call lasted 2 hours. Courtney has not called. I don't expect her to. Some things take longer, and some things never quite get there. What I do know is that the last time I spoke to Philip, he mentioned they were working through some things together. He said they'd had some hard conversations. He sounded like a man who was being honest with himself, which is different from a man who is just keeping the peace. I'm 63 years old. I live alone in a house in Columbus that I've owned for 18 years, and in the mornings I drink my coffee on the back porch and watch the light change over the yard I've kept up by myself for the better part of a decade. It's a good life, mostly. It's a quiet one. I spent a lot of years believing that love was something you proved by giving. That if I gave enough, money, time, patience, silence, it would eventually come back around in kind. I was wrong about that. Love isn't what you give, it's what you build with someone over time, and building requires both people to show up. You can't build it alone by putting in money and hoping the other person catches up. My son is catching up. I believe that. I see it in those phone calls, in the way he talks now compared to how he talked 2 years ago. He's not there yet. But he's moving. I am too. What I want anyone to hear. If you're somewhere in the middle of what I was in the middle of, if you've given everything and you're watching it get taken for granted, if you're sitting in your kitchen holding your phone after someone told you that you're not the right kind of person for your own son's celebration, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to say, this is not what I agreed to. You are allowed to protect yourself without stopping loving the person. Those two things can exist at the same time. My name is not on that clinic. My retirement savings are in that building's foundation and nobody's going to put a plaque up for me. That's fine. I didn't do it for the plaque up for me. That's fine. I didn't do it for the plaque, but I did it because he's my son. And my son owes me not money. He owes me a father-son relationship, not a donor-recipient one, not a landlord-tenant one, a real one. We're working on it. That's enough for now. I've been sitting with this for a while now, trying to figure out how to say it in a way that doesn't sound like a lecture. Because I'm not a man who lectures. I fix things. That's what I do. 31 years of figuring out what's broken and making it work again. But there are some things you can't fix with your hands, and the hardest lesson of my life has been learning which ones those are. What happened with Philip didn't come out of nowhere. I can see that clearly now. Every time I wrote a check without a conversation, every time I swallowed my discomfort because I didn't want to seem needy or difficult, every time I told myself that giving more would eventually close the distance, I was building toward that phone call with Courtney, the one where she told me, calmly, that I wasn't the right kind of person for the room. You don't get to that moment in one step. You get there through 100 small decisions that each seem reasonable at the time. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody warns you about. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates quietly until one morning you're standing in your kitchen watching your neighbor mow his lawn and 30 years of choices are sitting on your chest. I don't blame Courtney entirely. I played my part. I made it easy to take me for granted by never once requiring anything different. I showed up. I wrote the checks, I drove 4 hours round trip and said, I'm proud of you, and asked for nothing in return. Not acknowledgement, not inclusion, not even a phone call that wasn't prompted by a bank account change. I told myself that was strength. It wasn't. It was avoidance dressed up as generosity. Real strength, I've come to think, is knowing your own worth and requiring other people to meet it. Not demanding, not threatening, Just being clear. This is who I am. This is what I've given. And this is what I've given. And this is what a real relationship requires back. Philip needed to hear that from me years ago. I wasn't brave enough to say it until the cost became impossible to ignore. The part about intelligence, real intelligence, the kind that actually gets you through life, is that it's mostly about pattern recognition, seeing what's actually happening instead of what you wish were happening. I was smart enough to build a business and smart enough to sell a property at the right time and wire $220,000 to my son. I wasn't smart enough for a long time to see that I was funding a life that didn't include me. That's not a financial failure. That's a failure of honesty with myself. And then there's the matter of holding on, of not walking away when walking away would have been easier. I could have gone cold after that phone call with Courtney. I could have cut Philip off entirely and told myself he'd made his choice. Some people would call that dignity. I call it quitting. He is my son, the same kid who sat across a kitchen table from me at 17, trying to decide whether to be angry or sad. I wasn't going to quit on him, but I was done quitting on myself. Those are different things. Staying in someone's life and letting them take you for granted. Those are not the same thing, even though we tell ourselves they are. I stayed. I just stopped making it free. Philip is calling now, not because of the account, because of what the account finally made him look at. That's how it works sometimes. You don't change by hearing the truth. You change when the consequences of ignoring it finally show up in your actual life. Courtney told me I wasn't their crowd. The crowd she was protecting is getting expensive. That's not revenge. That's just reality doing what reality does. I'm 63. I've got good mornings on my back porch, and a yard I take care of myself and a son who is, slowly, learning to show up. That's enough. It took me too long to understand that enough is a complete sentence.